The great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched for nearly a mile in every direction. Its walls carved from the living crystal of a dead star, and its ceiling so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it when too many species breathed together in one place. 859 representatives sat in their designated pods, each one shaped to accommodate the unique biology of their species. And today, every single one of them had come to vote on what they called the human problem. High Counselor Vethrix of the Dominion stood at the central podium, his forearms spread wide in the traditional gesture of authority, and his scaled face showed no emotion as he addressed the assembly. For 300 years we have tolerated the presence of humanity in our midst, he declared, his voice amplified by ancient technology so that even the smallest delegate could hear him clearly. And for 300 years, they have brought nothing but chaos to our carefully ordered civilization. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber like waves across a still pond. The humans had arrived in the galactic community as newcomers, their ships primitive and their understanding of the universe laughably incomplete. But they had refused to accept their place at the bottom of the hierarchy. They asked questions that nobody wanted to answer and challenged traditions that had stood for 10,000 years. They demanded seats on councils they had not earned and spoke as equals to species that had mastered faster than light travel while humans were still living in caves. Worst of all, they had been right far too often for anyone's comfort when the Volcari agricultural system had begun to fail. 2 centuries ago, it had been human engineers who redesigned it from the ground up. And now 12 worlds depended on technology that only humans fully understood when the Nexus communication grid had suffered from quantum decay that threatened to cut off half the galaxy. It had been human scientists who solved the problem in 3 months when the greatest minds of 100 species had failed for decades. When ancient enemies had refused to share a room together, it had been human diplomats who somehow made them shake hands and sign peace treaties. The humans had made themselves essential, and many species resented them for it. Resolution 7 Omega will impose sanctions on all human trade, Vethrix continued, his golden eyes scanning the assembly with cold satisfaction. Restrict their travel between systems. Remove their representatives from all advisory positions, and remind them that they are guests in our galaxy who serve at our pleasure. The chamber erupted in applause from most of the delegates, though a few remained silent with worried expressions on their various faces. In the human section of the chamber, Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat alone, her dark hair pulled back in a simple style, and her formal uniform crisp and unwrinkled despite the long hours of debate. She was 63 years old and had served as humanity's voice to the galaxy for nearly 2 decades. And in all that time, she had never seen such open hostility directed at her species. The vote was called, and the numbers appeared on the great display that hung above the chamber like a second sun. 847 in favor of Resolution 7 Omega 12 against. The sanctions had passed by an overwhelming margin. Vethrix allowed himself a small smile of triumph as he turned to face the human ambassador, expecting to see defeat or anger or perhaps tears on her face. Instead, Elena Vasquez was smiling. She rose from her seat with calm dignity, gathered the documents that contained 3 centuries of human contributions to galactic civilization, and walked toward the exit with her head held high. Every eye in the chamber followed her, and the silence was so complete that her footsteps echoed like thunder in the crystal halls at the door. She paused and turned back to face the assembly one final time. "You will miss us when we are gone," she said, and her voice carried clearly to every corner of the great chamber without any amplification at all. Then she walked out, and the doors closed behind her with a sound like a tomb being sealed. The council celebrated their victory for exactly 6 hours. They held banquets and made speeches and congratulated themselves on finally putting the arrogant humans in their place. And Vethrix accepted praise from dozens of species who had long resented human influence. Then the reports started coming in. The first came from the Valkyrie homeworld, where confused officials reported that every human on the planet had simply vanished from their homes and workplaces without any warning or explanation. The second came from the Rithian military command, where admirals discovered that their human technical advisors had disappeared in the middle of crucial system upgrades. The third came from the Nexus Grid Central Hub, where engineers found empty chairs where human operators had been sitting just moments before. Within an hour, the Council received confirmation that every human in the known galaxy had vanished at exactly the same moment, and not a single trace remained to show where they had gone. No bodies were found. No ships were detected leaving. No distress signals were received. The humans had simply ceased to exist, as if the universe itself had erased them from reality. But they had not gone alone. Every piece of human technology vanished with them, from the smallest medical scanner to the largest space station. And every structure that human hands had built crumbled into dust that blew away on winds that seemed to come from nowhere. Even the records in alien databases became corrupted and unreadable. Centuries of human knowledge and history dissolving into meaningless static. The great chamber fell silent once more as the full scope of what had happened became clear to the assembled representatives. Vethrix stood frozen at his podium, his forearms hanging limp at his sides and his golden eyes wide with something that looked very much like fear. Ambassador Vasquez's final words echoed in his mind, and for the first time in his long life, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The lights in the chamber flickered once, twice, and then went dark as the power systems designed by human engineers 300 years ago finally failed. In the darkness, someone began to scream, and soon the screaming spread until the crystal walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the sound of 859 species, realizing all at once that they had just lost something they could never replace. The humans were gone, and the galaxy would never be the same again. 1 week after the vanishing, the Valkyrie Minister of Agriculture stood in the middle of what had once been the most productive farming region on his entire planet and watched his world begin to die. The crops were wilting in fields that stretched to the horizon, their leaves turning brown and their roots pulling away from soil that had somehow forgotten how to nourish them. 200 years ago, human engineers had redesigned the entire Valkyrie agricultural system after a plague had destroyed their native plants. And the new system had worked so well that nobody had ever bothered to learn how it actually functioned. Now those engineers were gone, and so were all their maintenance protocols and repair schematics and the countless small adjustments they made every season to keep the system running smoothly. The minister picked up a handful of dying grain and let it fall through his fingers like sand. "How long do we have?" he asked his assistant, though he already knew the answer would not be good. "At the current rate of failure, Minister, our food reserves will last approximately 3 months," the assistant replied with a trembling voice. "After that, our people will begin to starve." 12 colony worlds depended on this agricultural system, and not a single Valkyrie scientist understood it well enough to keep it running. Without human help, the minister closed his eyes and wondered how he would explain to billions of his people that they might die because the Galactic Council had decided to punish a species that had only ever tried to help them. 3,000 light years away, Admiral Kethra of the Rithian hegemony faced a different kind of disaster. Her fleet had been the most feared military force in the galaxy for 5 centuries. Their ships equipped with shield technology that could withstand weapons that would vaporize a small moon, and their warriors trained from birth to defend Rithian interests across 1,000 star systems. But the shields had been upgraded by human technicians just 6 months ago. And now those technicians were gone along with every piece of documentation about how the new harmonics worked without functioning shields. Our mighty warships were nothing more than very expensive targets. And word of Rithian vulnerability was already spreading through the criminal underworld, like fire through dry grass. Admiral, we have lost contact with 3 more patrol vessels, her communications officer reported, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Pirates attacked them near the outer rim, and our ships could not defend themselves. Kethra slammed her fist against her command console hard enough to crack the screen. The Rithian hegemony had not lost a ship to pirates in over 200 years. And now they were losing 3 in a single day, because no one had bothered to learn how their own defenses worked. She had voted against Resolution 7 Omega, one of the 12 who had opposed punishing the humans for the crime of being too helpful. And now she watched her life's work crumble, because 847 fools had decided that pride was more important than survival. But the true catastrophe was only beginning to reveal itself. The Nexus communication grid was the backbone of galactic civilization, a network of quantum-entangled relay stations that allowed instant communication across distances that would otherwise take centuries to cross every trade agreement. Every diplomatic message, every emergency call for help traveled through the Nexus. And without it, the galaxy would fragment into isolated pockets of silence separated by impossible gulfs of empty space. The humans had solved the quantum decay problem that plagued the original system 300 years ago. And their solution had been so elegant and so effective that no one had ever needed to improve upon it. Now the decay was returning, and the relay stations were failing one by one, like candles being snuffed out by an invisible hand. Entire sectors went dark without warning, cutting off millions of beings from any contact with the rest of civilization. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for generations suddenly became useless when merchants could no longer communicate with their destinations. Allies who had supported each other through countless crises found themselves unable to call for help when they needed it most. High Council of Vethrix stood before an emergency assembly of the Galactic Council, though now the chamber felt far too large for the few hundred representatives who had managed to arrive before the communications breakdown made travel coordination impossible. The crystal walls that had once gleamed with reflected starlight now seemed dull and lifeless, and the clouds that formed beneath the ceiling had turned an ugly gray color that matched the mood of everyone present. We must find a solution, Vethrix declared, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just 1 week ago. Our scientists are working around the clock to understand the human technology and restore our essential systems. A Valkyrie representative rose to speak, his normally green skin pale with exhaustion and fear. Our scientists have tried, High Counselor, but the human designs are beyond our understanding, he said, and his words echoed through the chamber like an accusation. It is as if they were built by beings from another dimension entirely, using principles that our greatest minds cannot even begin to comprehend. Shouts of anger erupted from various sections of the chamber, and delegates began pointing fingers at each other and at Vethrix himself. The Dominion leader watched his political allies turn against him one by one as the reality of their situation became impossible. To ignore his own homeworld had lost contact with its colonies 2 days ago, and his rivals were already calling for his execution as punishment for the disaster he had caused. But even as the chamber descended into chaos, Vethrix could not stop thinking about Ambassador Vasquez and her mysterious final smile. She had known this would happen. He realized with growing horror. She had known exactly what the humans meant to the galaxy, and she had tried to warn them with those 5 simple words. You will miss us when we are gone. The screaming in the chamber grew louder, but Vethrix barely heard it. He was too busy wondering if there was any way to undo what he had done, or if the galaxy he had sworn to protect was already beyond saving. 3 months after the vanishing, the galaxy finally understood what humanity had truly been. They had not just been traders who moved goods between distant worlds, or engineers who fixed problems that no one else could solve, or diplomats who somehow made enemies become friends. They had been the glue that held everything together, the invisible force that kept 1,000 different species from tearing each other apart. Every civilization in the galaxy had their own special gifts that made them unique and valuable. The Velkari had mastered the secrets of biology and could grow living ships that healed themselves after battle. The Rithians had perfected military discipline until their warriors moved as one like a single organism spread across 1,000,000 bodies. The Cathari had spent 10,000 years studying philosophy and could answer questions about the meaning of existence that other species did not even know how to ask. But none of them could talk to each other without help. The Velkari considered the Rithians to be violent savages who solved every problem with weapons instead of wisdom. The Rithians believed the Velkari were weak pacifists who would surrender to any enemy rather than fight for their beliefs. The Cathari thought both species were children playing games while the universe burned around them before the humans came. These 3 great civilizations had fought wars that lasted centuries and killed billions of innocent beings on both sides. After the humans came, they had somehow learned to sit at the same table and share meals together like old friends. No one had ever understood exactly how the humans did it. They would arrive at negotiations where both sides had sworn to destroy each other and somehow leave with a peace treaty that made everyone feel like they had won. They would listen to ancient grudges that stretched back thousands of years and somehow find a way to make both sides see that their enemies were just people who wanted the same things they did. They would take species that had nothing in common and somehow show them that they had everything in common if they only looked hard enough. Now the humans were gone, and all those old hatreds came flooding back like water through a broken dam. The border wars began in the 4th month after the vanishing. The sovereignty of 12 suns had been a peaceful alliance of 12 different species who had learned to work together under human guidance, but without human diplomats to smooth over their differences. Old arguments quickly turned into new conflicts. First came the accusations about unfair trade practices, then the threats of military action, then the actual shooting that left 3 colony worlds in ruins within 6 weeks. The sovereignty had fractured into 73 separate factions, each one convinced that they were the victims and everyone else was the enemy. The peacekeepers tried to intervene, but the peacekeepers had been founded by humans and led by humans for their entire existence, without human leadership. The various species in the organization could not agree on anything, not even which conflicts they should try to stop first. They argued for weeks while entire civilizations burned, and eventually the peacekeepers simply dissolved as their members went home to protect their own people instead. Vethrix received reports every day that made his blood run cold. The Outer Rim colonies were starving because human agricultural specialists had been the only ones who knew how to make crops grow on their harsh and unforgiving worlds. The inner systems were descending into chaos because human administrators had been the only ones who could coordinate the complex logistics of feeding and housing trillions of beings across hundreds of planets. The ancient enemies of the galaxy were waking up, sensing weakness in civilizations that had once been protected by human innovation and human courage. A young aide brought Vethrix a document that summarized the losses so far and the numbers were so terrible that he could barely bring himself to read them. 17 billion dead from famine as food distribution. Networks collapsed. 12 billion dead from wars that humans would have prevented with a few well-chosen words. 8 billion dead from diseases that human medical technology would have cured if it had not vanished along with its creators, and these were only the deaths that could be counted. In the regions where communications still functioned well enough to send reports, the true numbers were probably much higher. Vethrix sat alone in his quarters that night, stripped of his title by a council that needed someone to blame but kept alive because no one could agree on who should replace him. He thought about all the times he had complained about human arrogance, all the speeches he had made about putting humanity in their place, all the votes he had cast to limit human influence in galactic affairs. He had told himself that he was protecting galactic civilization from an aggressive species that wanted to control everything. Now he understood the truth that Ambassador Vasquez had tried to show him with her final smile. They were never the threat, he whispered to the empty room, and his voice cracked with an emotion that his species had no name for. The humans had never wanted to control the Twerfer galaxy. They had only wanted to help. In the same way that a parent helps a child or a friend helps a neighbor, they had given their knowledge freely to anyone who asked, and sometimes to those who did not ask but clearly needed it. They had defended species that could not defend themselves, and fed species that could not feed themselves, and healed species that could not heal themselves. They had asked for nothing in return except friendship and the chance to be part of something greater than themselves, and the galaxy had repaid them with suspicion and resentment, and finally with sanctions designed to humiliate them in front of everyone. Vethrix thought about his own children, who lived on a colony world that had gone silent 3 weeks ago. He did not know if they were alive or dead, and he might never know. He thought about Ambassador Vasquez, who had smiled at him even as he destroyed everything she had worked for, and he wondered if she had seen this future in his eyes when she spoke her final words. The galaxy was falling apart, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The humans had been the only ones who could have saved them, and the humans were gone. 2 years had passed since the vanishing, and the galaxy had become a graveyard of broken dreams and shattered civilizations. The population of the known universe had fallen by 40%, lost to wars and famines and plagues that swept through worlds that no longer had the technology or the knowledge to protect themselves. The Galactic Council still met in the Great Crystal Chamber, but now only 47 species sent representatives, and the chamber that had once held nearly 1,000 delegates felt empty and haunted by ghosts. Vethrix still attended every session, though he sat in the back rows now instead of at the central podium where he had once commanded the attention of the entire galaxy. His scales had turned gray with age and stress, and his forearms trembled slightly when he raised them to vote on the endless emergency measures that never seemed to make anything better. He had dedicated what remained of his life to a single purpose, one that consumed his every waking moment and haunted his dreams when he managed to sleep. He wanted to find out where the humans had gone, not to bring them back, because he knew he had no right to ask that of them after what he had done. He simply needed to know the truth, needed to understand how an entire species could vanish so completely that even the universe itself seemed to have forgotten they existed. He traveled to the ruins of human colonies and searched through the dust for any clue that might have been left behind. He interviewed survivors who had worked alongside humans and listened to their stories of kindness and generosity that made his heart ache with shame. He consulted scientists and philosophers and mystics from 100 different species, but none of them could explain what had happened or where the humans might have gone. Finally, in desperation, he sought out the Cathari. The Cathari were the oldest species in the known galaxy. Their civilization stretching back so far that they had records of stars being born that had already died and been reborn again. They lived on a world of eternal twilight at the very edge of explored space, and they rarely spoke to outsiders because they found most species too young and too foolish to understand their wisdom. But Vethrix had nothing left to lose. So he made the long journey to their homeworld and requested an audience with their eldest elder. The Cathari, who received him, was so ancient that their body had become translucent, their organs visible through skin that had thinned over millennia until it was almost like glass. They sat in a garden of bioluminescent plants that provided the only light on this dark world. And they studied Vethrix with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore. "You seek the humans," the elder said, and their voice was like wind moving through crystal chimes. "You wish to know where they have gone and why they left." Vethrix bowed his head in the gesture of respect that his species reserved for truly superior beings. "I need to understand," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I need to know if there is any hope of undoing what I have done." The Cathari elder was silent for a long time, so long that Vethrix began to wonder if they had fallen asleep or perhaps died while he watched. Then they spoke, and their words changed everything Vethrix thought he knew about the universe. "The humans are not gone," the elder said. "They are waiting." Vethrix felt his heart stop for a moment before they started again with painful intensity. "Waiting for what?" he asked. Barely able to speak, the humans understood something that most young species never learn. The elder continued. They understood that some lessons cannot be taught with words, only with absence. The elder rose from their seat and walked to a pool of still water that reflected the bioluminescent light like a mirror, made of shadows for 300 years. The humans gave freely of their gifts, and for 300 years, the galaxy took without gratitude, they said. The humans tried to teach you the value of cooperation and kindness and mutual support, but you would not listen, so they left, Vethrix whispered. So they stepped back, the elder corrected. They did not abandon you out of revenge or anger, but out of love. The kind of love that allows a child to fall so they can learn to stand on their own. Vethrix thought about all the suffering of the past 2 years. All the billions who had died because the galaxy could not function without human help. How can that be love? He asked. And his voice was bitter with pain. The elder turned to face him, and their ancient eyes held a compassion so deep that Vethrix felt like he was drowning in it. Before the humans came, your galaxy was divided and violent and filled with hatred, they said. After the humans came, you had peace and prosperity and cooperation. But you did not value these things because you had not earned them. And now you are learning what it means to lose what you never appreciated. And you are learning what it takes to build something precious from nothing but hope and determination. Vethrix fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of understanding that crashed over him like a wave. How do we bring them back? He begged. Tell me what we must do. The Cathari elder knelt beside him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You cannot bring them back, they said softly. They will return when you have become worthy of them, when you have learned to be even slightly what they were to you. How long will that take? As long as it needs to take. Perhaps years, perhaps generations, perhaps never if you fail to learn the lesson they are trying to teach. Vethrix wept then, the first tears his species had shed in all of recorded history. And the Cathari elder held him as he cried for everything he had lost and everything he might never have again. 50 years had passed since the day the humans vanished, and the galaxy had become something new. It was not what it had been before, because that was impossible. Too much had been lost, and too many scars remained on worlds and hearts alike. But the survivors had learned, slowly and painfully and with countless setbacks along the way, to become something better than they had ever been before. The Valkyrie had rebuilt their agricultural systems from the ground up. Not with human technology, but with their own ingenuity combined with knowledge shared freely by species they had once considered enemies. Now they sent food ships to any world that needed them, asking nothing in return except the promise that the recipients would help others when they were able. The Rithians had transformed their military from a force of conquest into a force of protection, defending shipping lanes and colony worlds. Without demanding payment or political allegiance, their warriors still trained from birth. But now they trained to save lives instead of taking them, even the old enemies who had fought for millennia before the humans came had learned to sit together and talk through their differences instead of reaching for weapons. It was harder than it had been when human diplomats guided the conversations. And sometimes the talks broke down and tempers flared. But they kept trying because they had seen what happened when they stopped. The new Galactic Council met in the same crystal chamber where Resolution 7 Omega had been passed half a century ago. Though the chamber had been repaired and restored by hands from a dozen different species working together, only 47 representatives attended now. Far fewer than the 859 who had voted to punish humanity. But these 47 had earned their seats through dedication and sacrifice instead of political maneuvering. High Counselor Even of the Valkyrie stood at the central podium on the 50th anniversary of the vanishing, preparing to deliver a memorial speech that had become an annual tradition. She was young by the standards of galactic politics, barely a century old, and she had grown up hearing stories about the human era as if it were a legend from ancient times. Her generation had never met a human, never shaken a human hand or heard a human laugh or watched a human perform the small everyday miracles that the older generation still spoke of with wonder and longing. But they had learned from the stories, and they had tried their best to live up to the example that the humans had set. We gather today to remember what was lost. Even began, a voice carrying through the chamber that had once echoed with screams of panic, and to celebrate how far we have come in our journey to become worthy of. She stopped mid-sentence as every sensor in the chamber suddenly went wild with alarms. The delegates rose from their seats in confusion and fear, old instincts warning them that unexpected events usually meant new disasters in this post-human galaxy. Then the main display flickered to life, showing a view of space just beyond the system's outer planets. Ships were emerging from fold space, more ships than anyone had seen in one place since before the vanishing. And they appeared in perfect formation, like a military parade. But these were not warships coming to attack. These were human ships. The designs were different from anything in the old records, sleeker and more advanced, but the markings were unmistakable, and the energy signatures matched patterns that had been absent from the galaxy for 50 long years. Thousands of vessels hung in space like stars that had decided to visit, and at their center was a single ship larger than any the watching delegates had ever seen. A communication request came through on frequencies that no one had used in half a century. Even accepted the request with trembling hands, and a face appeared on the screen that made several of the older delegates cry out in shock. Ambassador Elena Vasquez looked older than she had in the historical recordings, her hair now completely white, and her face lined with the marks of time and experience, but her eyes were the same, warm and wise, and filled with a kindness that seemed to embrace everyone who looked into them, and she was smiling. The same mysterious smile that the stories always mentioned. The smile she had worn when she walked out of this very chamber 50 years ago. "Hello again," she said, and her voice was exactly as the old recordings described it. Calm and confident and somehow filled with laughter, even when she was serious. "We have been watching, and we are proud of you. Most of you anyway." The chamber was so silent that Yvonne could hear her own hearts beating. "You came back," she finally managed to say. "We never really left," Vasquez replied. "We just stepped back far enough for you to see yourselves clearly, to understand what you were capable of becoming without us holding your hands. But the vanishing, all those who died, all the suffering, was terrible and heartbreaking and necessary," Vasquez said. And her smile faded into something more serious. "We tried for 300 years to teach you through example, and you refused to learn. Some lessons can only come through loss." Yvonne thought about all the stories she had heard, all the billions who had died in the chaos that followed the human departure, all the generations that had struggled to rebuild what had been destroyed. Was it worth it? She asked. And she was not sure if she was asking Vasquez or herself. "Look around you," the human ambassador replied. "Look at who is sitting in that chamber. Look at what they have built together. Look at what you have become." Viven looked, and for the first time she truly saw Velkari and Rithian delegates sat side by side. Species that had once tried to exterminate each other, now working together as if they had been allies for millennia. Cathari. Philosophers shared seats with former warlords, who had renounced violence and dedicated themselves to peace. Every representative in the chamber had earned their position through service to others, not through conquest or manipulation. They had become, in their own imperfect way, what the humans had always hoped they could be. "The galaxy does not need humans to function," Vasquez continued. "It never did. It just needs species who care about each other the way we cared about you. And you have learned that lesson better than we ever dared to hope." "And now," Yvonne asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "now we would like to come home," Vasquez said. And her smile returned with full force. "If you will have us." Yvonne did not need to call for a vote, but she did anyway, because this moment deserved to be remembered properly in the historical records. 47-0. Unanimous agreement to welcome humanity back to the galactic community when the human ships began to dock at stations that had stood empty for 50 years. Crowds gathered to watch from every species that could reach the ports in time when Ambassador Vasquez walked through the doors of the council chamber. The delegates rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted for nearly an hour, and when the question came of what position humanity would hold in the new Galactic Council, the answer was decided before the vote was even called. The humans were not given a seat at the table. They were given the head of it, not because the galaxy could not function without them, but because they had proven through 300 years of service and 50 years of patient waiting that they deserved to lead. Vasquez took her new position with grace and humility, just as the stories said she would, and her first act as head of the council was to propose a memorial for all those who had died during the vanishing. "Let us remember them not as victims," she said, "but as teachers, for their sacrifice taught us all what it truly means to be a civilization." The memorial was approved unanimously, and as the delegates filed out of the chamber to begin the work of building a new future together, Yvonne found herself walking beside the legendary human ambassador. "Was it hard?" Yvonne asked. "Watching us suffer for all those years." Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with an emotion that Yvonne could not quite identify. "It was the hardest thing we have ever done," she admitted. But parents do not help their children by solving every problem for them. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back and let them learn to stand on their own. And if we had failed, then we would have tried again, Vasquez said. As many times as it took for as long as it took. Because that is what family does. She put her hand on Ivan's shoulder and smiled one last time. "Welcome to the family," she said. "We are so glad to finally be home, and for the first time in 50 years. The crystal chamber of the Galactic Council rang with the sound of laughter instead of screams. Human and alien voices joined together in celebration of a future that suddenly seemed brighter than anyone had dared to imagine.